So, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Welcome to session 2 of this webinar on self-knowledge. I want to put something out before we start this session, and that is a request from you all, if not an invitation, a request from you all that there's going to be a lot of content here that will be shared, which will be, I hope, inshallah, will be useful information. And there'll be a lot of concepts that are shared and spoken about, but I would like to request or invite you to invite you to not only listen to the words through the medium of your minds, so that it's not just conceptual knowledge that's being shared, but to be a bit more open than just listening to the concepts through our ears, and taking in those concepts only and solely as information that's being fed to our minds. It would be an honor for me if the things that are being shared were to reach people's hearts. And so there's a two-way thing in this, and the first is that those who are attending should be present with their hearts, and therefore their listening shouldn't just be, or at least my invitation is, and my request from you all is that when you listen, that you listen through the ears of your hearts, meaning that you listen with the presence of your hearts to the content. And this also puts a burden on me. The onus is on me to therefore also speak from the heart, because as Imam Ali alayhi salam says, words that come from the tongues only reach the ears and then they go out of them, but words that come from the heart, it reaches the hearts. And what we really want to do here is to work on understanding ourselves and to build from that. And when we talk about building or self-building, it is an act of the heart. It is an act of the soul. And so to really benefit and to engage with the content that's being shared, one has to actively be present with the content and not just receive the content from as conceptual knowledge, but one has to receive the content from in their hearts. And when words are shared from the hearts, and this requires a struggle for me, because what it means is that I have to come to a place of being empty of my own biases and my own prejudices and my own ego, and to come to a place of presence and holding the presence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala within me, so that the content that's being shared isn't from me or for me, but it is first and foremost, it's affecting me because it's coming from this place of presence. So I'm the first beneficiary of the content here, and then to those who are listening, because their hearts are open, inshallah, they are also beneficiaries. And so when something is received in the heart, it creates a haraka, it creates a movement or a momentum internally. And with spiritual sciences, or with self-knowledge and building the self, the real shift that we want to have is an existential shift. It's an existential growth, an existential progress. It's the same with when we engage with anything spiritual, or that we consider to be of spiritual nature. For instance, when we're engaging with the Holy Quran, reading it or listening to it, it's easy for them to just be words that pass by without us listening. But if we really want to engage with the content, and this is why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Holy Quran that أَفَلَا يَتَعَقِّلُونَ الْقُرْآنَ أو أَفَلَا يَتَدَبَّرُونَ الْقُرْآنَ أَمْ عَلَى قُلُوبِهِمْ أَقْفَالُهَا. Do they not reflect over the Quran, or do their hearts have their locks on them? So the hearts are locked. And elsewhere he says لَهُمْ قُلُوبٌ لَا يَعْقِلُونَ بِهَا. They have hearts which they do not think with, and uses the word aql or intellect for the heart, suggesting that the heart also has an intelligence, and the heart also has receptivity. The heart also is able to receive and and many things. You know, the heart is a place where Allah inspires us. The heart is a place where Allah um, casts knowledge in. Imam Jafar al-Sadiq said that real knowledge is not by excessive study, but it is a light which Allah shines into the hearts of those whom He wishes, or casts into the hearts of those whom He wishes. So there is an intelligence also of the heart. And when we're talking about spiritual sciences or self-building or self-knowledge, the movement or the momentum that needs to take place is not just an intellectual one, but it's an inner one of the heart. So that the heart is affected to a degree that it begins to awaken. And this is the first stage. Awakening is on the spiritual journey. The first step to progressing on the spiritual journey is al-yaqla, is to awaken. So we want to try and engage with this content, not just as conceptual ideas in the mind, but also as intellectual substance which is being fed to our hearts. And that requires that we are present and listening from this place of our hearts. And it's we're allowing the content to be received in that place. And that also means that we have to have a level of objectivity. And the objectivity that we have to have is to be free and empty of our own biases and our own prejudices and our own ego. So that if there is even certain things that we may find challenging in what's being shared, that we come from or approach it from this place which is empty of the conditionings that we've had. So whether that be the conditionings of our past, or the conditionings of the tradition that we've been brought up in, or the conditions that we've taken and imbibed through education, or the conditions that we've had for society and the cultures that we've lived in, or the condition that we've taken from our families. So to really arrive at truth requires of us to remove those prejudices and those biases and be open and willing. And the openness that we have is what allows us to be free. And we spoke last week about true worship being the worship of the free man. And in order for us to come to Allah truly as true worshippers of Allah, we have to come to Him as free beings. So that's the first thing I wanted to mention, is just that when we are trying to connect with these things, allow the intellectual concepts to also work with the heart to the extent, to a degree that it begins to, we entertain it first and foremost in the mind, but then we also bring it to a place that then transcends just the mind and also enters the heart. So until we reach a point where the heart and the mind amalgamate and become in unison or in oneness, which is internal or inner tawheed. You know, a lot of the time we talk about the conceptualization of God as this one being, but there's also a tawheed which is in practical sense, and we attain this through arriving at inner tawheed first and foremost. And the Tawheed internally is that we arrive at a state of oneness internally within ourselves, so that we're not fragmented, we're not dispersed, we're not sort of have scattered thoughts in all places. And we see this even in prayer, for instance, when we're trying to engage with God. The goal is that we can come to a state of internal unison with the thoughts, the words, and the feeling and the being who we're talking to, and internalizing that state of tawheed within us. So we collect ourselves together on different levels so that we can attain tawheed internally. So there's this connectedness between the heart and the mind and our thoughts and our words. So similarly, because our goal here is tawheed and it is to gain proximity and closeness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the request is that let's try and bring that unison into the content that's being shared. So now I want to move on to the slides. So we spoke a little bit in the first session about the fact that we tend to recognize that there are different types of journeys that a person takes. And if we were to collectively summarize those journeys, we could identify that there is, so we begin to practice our religion when we're children and as we grow up into young adults, abiding by the rules and regulations of the Sharia. So, abiding by the obligations that are there, the religious instructions, and refraining from the prohibitions, refraining from those things which are forbidden to us. And this is a kind of journey that people go through, which is, I would say, is a journey through the Sharia. It's a sayr fi Sharia. But if we observe the lives of the prophets and the imams and the saints and sages of all times and of all eras, we find that there is one theme that you find collectively in all of them. This is a universal thing: is that their journey wasn't just that they awoken themselves to something higher, and their real journey was one of traversing existentially on a path. So it wasn't just fulfilling certain rites and rituals. It wasn't just standing, bowing, genuflecting, prostrating, raising their hands, or reciting certain verses, or going around a physical building and giving charity. It wasn't just the outward form of those rituals and practices, but there was an inner journey taking place. And we can see this in the example of the Prophet, who, even before the Sharia was revealed to him, even before the Quran was revealed to him, even before revelation was given to him, he would go and spend time in a cave or in a mountain, and he would spend time in reflection, and he would go internally within himself and disengage from the noise of the world and disconnect from everything else and just go to a deeper place internally. And so he was going on a journey within himself and arriving at certain truths and certain understandings and realizing that there is something greater to this world and a greater purpose that we have, and that there is more meaning to than just the mundane lifestyle and just living by like a trinket, just going through the motions of going through education and getting a degree, and then going and so into employment, and then making money, and then having a family, and then building life together, and then a house, having a home, and then having grandchildren, and so on and so forth. It wasn't just going through those practices, but they were actually going through a journey internally within themselves. And the Sharia was then later revealed. somehow I've lost this. 1 second. Yeah, the Sharia was then later revealed to the Prophet, and the Sharia was there to refine his spiritual journey. So when we look at the examples of people like the Prophet or the Imams, they were going on a journey, and the primary thing was this journey. Everything else was the backdrop. So even the laws or the regulations, those were the backdrop. Well, they came to refine that journey. So it makes no sense for us to simply satisfy ourselves by with the idea that we're fulfilling the rites and rituals of the Sharia without actually going on a journey ourselves, without actually partaking on moving towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or moving towards truth, or moving towards our own perfection, or moving towards deeper meaning and understanding. So there are these journeys that are taking place, and the purpose of this course is to try and shed some light onto that and awaken us to that. Okay, so the first slide, which you should have in front of you, says self-knowledge, spirituality, mysticism, esotericism, irfan, Sufism. So now there's several titles there, and the reason why I've chosen to speak about this is because over the week I've had a few people bring up this discussion with regards to what is the difference between sort of irfan and Sufism. What is spirituality and mysticism? I think it's really important that we give this definition. And again, like I said, let's try and be objective when we engage with this. So irfan or Sufism is spirituality. We generally tend to ascribe irfan, which is essentially it's spiritual practice. It's the science of seeking deeper knowledge or knowledge of the self, and then consequently through that knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And Sufism is also a similar thing. In fact, they're both, the desire of both is to get closer to Allah through spiritual practice. And getting closer to Allah requires understanding and depth, requires gaining ma'rifah of Allah, gaining knowledge of Allah. Now, we tend to ascribe irfan to the Shia tradition and Sufism to the Sunni tradition. But there's a lot of difficulty associated with doing that, and the reason this is the case is because there isn't actually one particular identity that you can say this is what irfan is, or this is what mysticism is, or this is what mystics are, or this is what Sufism is, or this is what a Sufi is. Much like when we look at, for instance, I'm coming from a Shia background myself, and someone who's trained in the tradition. When we look at Tashayyu today or Shiism today, there's so much variety. There are so many different types of Shias. There are so many different types of, and equally there are so many different types of Sunnis. Yes, there may be one singular theme that defines Shiism, which is the fact that Shias believe and follow the infallibility of the 12 Imams, and that's perhaps a defining factor for Tashayyu. But other than that, there's so much variety of what a Shia is. You know, there's so many Shias who have different ideas and opinions about things. There are certain Shias who follow particular scholars, or they follow certain religious instructions which are contrary to the instructions that another Shia may follow. Similarly, when we're talking about irfan and Sufism, and particularly Sufism, there's so much variety that you can't really pinpoint and say this is what Sufism is. And classically, what we tend to do is to say Sufis are these people who wear coarse clothing, and they walk around, or they spend time in retreat and away from society, abandoning the world, living lowly, destitute lives, and spending their entire day in dhikr of Allah and chanting names. Some of them may shake their bodies or they physically go back and forth, and some of them may swirl, some of them may go dance around in circles and chant certain names of Allah. That's not really what Sufism is, because there's so many different people and types of Sufis. Like there are those that you would never recognize or understand or know to be a Sufi, who live normal lives, who live outwardly a life of luxury, a life of living an average life, a life where they go to work and they have employment and they have a family and they have wealth and they engage in those things, and they aren't people who look to be abandoning the world. So there isn't really this one sort of identity that we can say this is what Sufis are and this is what Irfan is. And in fact, the spiritual sciences and many of those who engage in this, the reason why there's this sort of universality in the ideas and the principles that are shared is that this is a science which it doesn't have a madhab, it doesn't have a school of thought, and it's Ibn Arabi, famously, who is recognized as a Sufi within the Sunni tradition or a mystic. He famously said, "Mata madhabtu b'madhabin," that I didn't ascribe to a particular school or doctrine, and meaning that yes, although in terms of fiqh jurisprudence, yes, he was a practicing Sunni, but in terms of his spiritual journey and his mystical path, he wasn't pursuing this journey just as a Sunni, but he was someone who was pursuing truth. He was someone who was looking for truth, and wherever truth was, he was trying to relate to that. And there's an interesting story also that at the time where there was, at the time of Imam Ali alayhi salam, there was a lot of civil war that took place. We had the Battle of Jamal and Nahrawan and so on. So there was one occasion where a person came to the Imam Ali alayhi salam and said, "Oh Ali," and I'm paraphrasing this, but we find that there are Muslims fighting Muslims right now. On one end, we have, for instance, the wife of the Prophet and some great companions, and on the other end, we have you and your companions who are also Muslims, and you're the cousin of the Prophet, and you are, the Prophet has said so many things about you. Ali ma al-haq wa haqqu ma Ali. Ali is with the truth, and the truth is with Ali, and so on and so forth. So we have all these great things about you, but so where's the truth? Because to us, it looks like Muslims are just killing Muslims. Believers are just killing believers. You're both people who engage in night vigil. You're both people who recite Quran. You're both people who turn towards the Kaaba and pray 5 times a day, or in the direction of the Qibla. So where is the truth? And Imam alayhi salam says this profound thing, and I think this is something which reverberates throughout history, or should at least. And he said, "Inna dinullah la ya'rufu bil-rajal." Indeed, the religion of Allah is not known by people. It's not defined by people. Bal ya'raf bi'ayat al-haq. Rather, it is defined and known by the signs of truth. Fa'raf al-haq ta'raf ahla. Know the truth and you'll know its people. So you see this profound statement that Imam Ali salam gives. He says, look, he doesn't come and say, look, the Prophet said, Ana Madinatul Ilm wa Aliyun Babuha. I am the city of knowledge and Ali is its gate. He didn't say the Prophet said the truth is with Ali and Ali is with the truth. He didn't come and bring out all these references, all these praises that have been mentioned about him. He said, look, the standard for knowing the truth, or the people of truth, is that religion is not defined by men. The truth and the way to God is not defined by people or personalities. And this is why Imam Ali Islam also, in another statement, he says, don't listen to what is being said. Sorry, don't listen to who is saying it, but to what is being said. Look at what's being said and not and who is saying it. So take the truth from that. Take what you can from the truth, regardless of who's saying it. So the Imam says the signs of truth are what define religion. فَاعْرَفَ الْحَقِّ تَعْرَفَ عَلَيْهِ. Then find the truth, know the truth. And this is a fitri thing, the being able to identify truth. It's something which is innate within us. And if we can remove the barriers that cover or are casted on our fitra, the hijabs, through the conditioning and whatnot that we have, and just sit with realizing what the truth is, we'll find the people of truth. So people like Ibn Arabi or other mystics or other great sages and saints, their concern was truth. Unfortunately, what tends to happen is that people who are not pursuing that journey, who are very much engaged in the world of dunya, and the mystics refer to the dunya as alim al-muzahima, the world of contest, the world of each trying to better themselves over the other, each impelling upon them over the other. So they are doing this kind of actively putting zahma on other people. So there's always this, in the people who are more materialistic, you'll find that they tend to always concern themselves and engage with I want to, for instance, classic narratives are, I want to be more beautiful than she is, or I want to have more money than he has. Obviously, they don't overtly express those things, but internally, that this is the dialogue that's going on internally within them, that they want to try and compete with what other people have. So if they find that someone has a brand new house, they'll want to get an even better house than them. Or if somebody has a brand new car, they'll try and get an even better model of that car. And so the world of the dunya is more alam al-muzahim, and people who are of the material world or attached to the material world, they tend to hold these narratives more. Whereas people who rise above that, who transcend above the dunya, are people who have elevated themselves from that narrative, and their concern is truth. And so for them, they don't care for those things. Their real concern, and this is why you find that they never argue about or try to bring down other people. They never try to promote themselves. They never try to push their own agenda or their own ego. But they've reached a place of humility and humbleness that they are just seeking the truth, and they're not concerned about what other people have or what other people are doing or how much progress they've made or what achievements they've had. And those people collectively come together, and that's where you find that they tend to have a lot more love, because they're no longer bound by the hindrances of hate and envy and jealousy and competition, but they come together in this connectedness, and they appreciate other people, and they appreciate variety, and they appreciate seeing people doing well, and so on and so forth. So when it comes to seeking the truth, people who walk this journey, they detach themselves from those ideas, or they transcend them, those lowly ideas or ideas of the materialistic world. And so there isn't really this one definition that we can say this is what Irfan is and this is what Sufism is. It's all spiritual practice, and spiritual science is a science which is universal, and it's a science that anyone can work through and attain and progress in. And you don't have to be of a particular school of thought or ideology to achieve this. It's like any other science that you can progress yourself in. So too is the case with spirituality. Now, obviously, there are certain principles that you would adopt to help you and assist you in refining that journey. The other thing I want to talk about is mystical experience. And I know I dragged on a lot about that point, but I think it was very important to mention. The other point is about mystical experiences. such as dreams, visions, unveilings, and the imaginative faculty, is that sometimes certain individuals may experience uh, or have a spiritual experience, or they may, for instance, see a dream or a vision or an unveiling. And that might not necessarily sit well with people from another school of thought. For instance, you may have a Sufi who says, I had a dream of X companion and I saw him in this lofty position. And for whatever reasons or whatever the conditioning that I have from my particular tradition dictates that that can't be possible because that individual is, from my opinion and my perspective, is not a good person, and he's unfavorable in my opinion. So then we immediately believe that that person is misguided, or he's wrong, or he's erroneous, and that's an unfair assessment, because what we have to realize is that a lot of these experiences come through the medium. In fact, all experiences, they come through the medium of our own selves and using and deploying our imaginative faculty. So anyone who has any experience, it has to have an expression or a form. Whether that's, and we all have these, we have dreams, so we see this all the time, and our dreams have a particular expression or a form. So for instance, we may see a particular saint or sage, or even an imam or a prophet in our dream. And that image, that has to have a form or an expression. And the way that it works is that the message is a message perhaps of truth that's being revealed to us. But the form or the expression it takes and the vision that we see comes from within our own subconscious, within our own mind, from the imaginative faculty. And this is why classically, if you are from the Shia doctrine, then you may, if you have a dream of, for instance, seeing one of the imams, classically you'll see him either with having a luminous face where you can't see his face and you just see light, or because subconsciously that's how you perceive him, or you'll see him in the image or the form that we generally tend to have, um, taken from the pictures that have been portrayals of the imams, and our nafs, or our soul, um, extracts that and stores that and saves it. So when we have the dream, it shows itself in that form. What we need to realize is that there's a difference between the form or the image and the truth that's being revealed. So if a person sees, because of their particular background and conditioning and school of thought, they may see a particular companion who is unfavorable to people of another school of thought, they see that person expressing it, it's because that's the school of thought or the tradition that they have learned from. And this is why you find that Christians, for instance, or Christian mystics, they always have, most times the experiences that they'll have is of Jesus giving them a message. The message itself is true, but the form of the expression that's come from is through the medium of the person themselves. And because they are believers in Jesus or in Isa, it expresses itself in that form. Buddhists will therefore see Buddha, Jews will see Moses, and Muslims will tend to see the prophets or the imams. That's because internally, what's imbibed within us, our imaginative faculty is being has reached this point and is experiencing that through that medium or that person. And we know this also because when you look at the Quranic narrative, the Quran is truth being revealed. But that truth is from Allah. And that truth needs to have a form or an expression. So this is why when you look at the Holy Quran, the narratives that are there that were revealed to the Prophet were very much relevant to him and his time. And that's why the Quran talks about camels and horses as a means of a ride, as opposed to talking about cars. For us, if you want to talk about a means of transportation or a ride, you would talk about a vehicle, a car, a motorcycle, a bus, an aeroplane. But the Quran doesn't talk about that, because what was relevant to the Prophet and what was his internal, uh, you know, form that was memorized within his being was camels and horses, because that's what he was exposed to and that's what he saw. And therefore, the truth that was revealed had that form and that expression. So this is important, because when we see people talk about other personalities who, for instance, may not necessarily be favorable to us, so a Christian says, I saw Christ, and then they reveal a truth, we can't necessarily just discard that completely and say this person's on falsehood. The message that's being presented may be true itself, even though it may not conform with our particular, perspective, in the sense that the form that it's taken as Jesus or the Son of God or so on isn't acceptable to us. And that's important to understand for spiritual sciences. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, certain mystical experiences, they can reveal specific qualities. They reveal a particular trait sometimes. So you may see a person in a dream, let's say, or in an unveiling or a vision, and what that vision or that unveiling is showing you is a particular trait that that person has or represents or reflects or embodies within themselves. So you may see someone in a dream, and because they have courage, you the vision or the dream or the experience that is showing you is the particular attribute of courage. It's not the be all and end all of that personality of that person, because that person might have other faults. So you might see this person in a high lofty station in the experience that you're having, and you think, wow, this is incredible, I'm seeing this person who's reached this really high position. But they may also have faults in them, but what's being shown to you in that particular experience is only the virtue and not the fault. And similarly, it can be flipped the other way around. So you might see someone who has lots of virtues but has maybe one flaw, and the experience that you have is just the flaw that's been shown. So that's been highlighted to you, and therefore you can't use those experiences and say this is proof of that person being evil or bad, because it's only one particular trait that's being shown. And you likewise, you can't do it the other way around and say this is evidence that this person is a holy person or a religious person or a devout person or a muttaqi, because you've only seen maybe perhaps one particular attribute. Now with this, it's important to always go back to an expert in this field, someone who knows this and understands the sciences, and they can help you to unpack that and to understand this further. What this brings us to is separating the person and the character trait or the action, which in Arabic is tafkik. And this is very important. This is so important in the way we interact with people. So you might find people who have so many good qualities, and have so many great traits about them. But they have one particular thing which is undesirable. And just because of that, we can't just highlight that one undesirable trait about them and say, and discard the person completely. So imagine you had a check for £1 million, £1 million check, and this check was crisp and it was perfect and it was beautiful. But on the corner of that check somewhere, there was a slight glitch, a slight a marking on that, a slight imperfection. No one in their right mind would say, "Oh, this £1 million check is not worthy of anything," and just scrump it up or tear it up and throw it in the bin. But when it comes to people, we tend to do this so much that people have their own value and their own worth, and because of one minor fault or trait, we completely throw them out or cast them away, and throw them in the bin, because of that one thing. But we have to look at the holistic picture and see, actually, in fact, maybe this person actually has lots of virtuous traits, and the particular fault or the undesirable quality that is being expressed in that individual is only a speck, like the speck on a check. And the way we should really be interacting with this is, if we had £1 million check and there was a slight glitch or an imperfection on it, we would spend the whole night getting the most technical tools, the most precise tools to try and remove that. If this was something really valuable to us, if it was like a piece of jewelry or something which was worth a lot, we would go to the most uh, difficult things, and try and get the most technical tools to try and work at removing that particular imperfection from that thing. But when it comes to people, we'll just discard them straight away, instead of, rather than making ourselves closer to them and trying to help them to work through those imperfections or those undesirable things. So this is what's important with tahqiq. And now, even when you look at the way that the Ahlul Bayt alayhi salam interacted, there was this occasion where someone came to Imam Sajjad alayhi salam and asked, and remember, bear this in mind, the context of everything that took place in Karbala, and asked the Imam, what was Yazid like? And the Imam, and this is a beautiful example of this, he said he was a great poet. The Imam, he said he was, after everything that he saw and witnessed and everything that took place in Karbala, and all his family members and how their lives were taken, and his closest companions, and the brutality and how the women were treated. After seeing all of that, and after seeing Yazid playing with with the head of his father, and disrespecting it and dishonoring it, after seeing all of that, he didn't say any of those things. He didn't say he was a vile man, he was a vicious man, of course he was all those things. But what the Imam was highlighting, he said he was a great poet. So he was doing this tahqiq. He was, giving everything its right, recognizing that everything needs to be in proportion. That when you see something, you don't just discard the entirety of that thing, but you separate the personality and the trait. And so there's certain experiences that mystics may have that they see. Maybe it's not even that the personality themselves, but it's the trait that they've done tafkik of, that they've separated it from, and they've seen that particular thing and separated that from the personality. And so when they see the vision, it's also reflective of that. So those are just a few points that I wanted to mention here. I know I did go on for a while about that, but I hope that was useful and beneficial. Now, moving along. So I want to introduce the 7 levels of the soul. And we mentioned that the soul has 7 levels, and we briefly mentioned the stations of the soul in the previous session. Depending upon the state or the condition and the attributes of the soul, it is classified within one of the 7 stations. And the soul must pass through these stations in order to transcend and reach perfection. So it's impossible for us to not go through any of these stations. We will at some point be, anyone who's journeying towards Allah or a journey towards perfection falls somewhere within these 7 stations. So we all have a place where we are classified or classed within these levels or these stations. When we talk about the soul or the nafs, it's much like the example of when we talk about water. And I think I gave this example of how water can be reflective of barzakh, the intermediary for things. And then we spoke about it in the last session, so I'm not going to go into that now. But sometimes when we look at how water is, so when water, for instance, flows in a stream, we will call that a stream, or we will call that a river. When water pours down from the sky, we will call that rain. When water takes the form of a lake, we'll call that a lake. When it's frozen, when water's frozen, we call that ice. And when water evaporates, we call that steam. So all of those are reflective of the conditions and the nature of water. Similarly, when the soul has certain qualities or traits, we will give it a particular name. Right. So the first of those is Nafs al-Amara, which is the soul that commands towards evil. And we won't be able to go through all the levels of the soul in this one session due to the time constraints, but we will try and cover at least the first, which is the Nafs al-Amara, and then if anybody has any questions or comments, then we'll take those. So, yes, Hassan?
Here, as everybody else can hear as well.
Can you hear? Hello?
Yeah, we can hear you. Here and there you're cutting off, but we're okay.
Okay, fine, perfect. Hassanin, I hope you can hear me also. Okay, so Nafs al-Amara. Nafs al-Amara is the soul, it's the first level of the soul. It's the level of the soul which is, in English, it's the commanding soul, meaning the soul that commands towards evil. And this is also mentioned in the Quranic reference or in Surah Yusuf, when Prophet Yusuf alayhi salam is approached by Zulaykha and she tries to seduce him by closing him into her chambers. And then, as we know, the story unfolds that she chased him around the room, and it says, "Lawla burhan Rabbi." If it had not been for the proof of his Lord, he may have fallen into sin. And because he recognized and saw the proof of God, he tried to flee from that, and the reference that he himself mentions, وَمَا أُبَرِّئُ نَفْسِي إِنَّ النَّفْسَ لَأَمَّارَةٌ بِالسُّوءِ إِلَّا مَا رَحِمَ رَبِّي إِنَّ رَبِّي غَفُورٌ رَحِيمٌ. He says, I don't absolve my soul. Most surely the carnal soul commands towards evil, except in as much as my Lord has had mercy. Indeed, my Lord is all forgiving and all merciful. So this is the soul, or the level of the soul, when it befriends and surrenders itself to the illicit desires, to the carnal appetites, to caprice, to whimsical passions. It engages with the material world. It's very engaged in lustful things. It pursues the dunya. It engages a lot with food and drink and eating. It's very much the animal self, the animal soul, and typically also found in children because their intellects are not refined or ripened. And so they have this animal self when they engage with food and drink and play and enjoying playful things. So this is the soul which enjoys engaging with sexual passions and so on. And obviously, this is a soul which doesn't recognize boundaries. So it doesn't concern itself to the restrictions that are there or given within religious instructions to the Sharia. So it doesn't concern itself with halal and haram or whether this is permissible or impermissible. Sometimes, of course, those are hindrances. So if we were to imagine ourselves being removed from having those instructions, the law, the Sharia, we really have to question ourselves that would we engage in those things because we ourselves recognize, or we've elevated spiritually to the degree that we recognize that that's not conducive to our spiritual growth and it's not something we want to engage in? And is it just the laws that are making us abide by those practices? Is it just because God has told us that we have to pray that we pray? Or is it something that our soul would reach the point where it would actively enjoy that, engage in that because it sees the value in that? And so this is the soul which it doesn't care for those regulations. And maybe we are abiding by those regulations because of fear of punishment or hope of paradise. So this is as the text says here, the nafs is the heart about which Allah says, this is a reminder for whoever has a heart. So sometimes the Quran may refer to the heart, and what it's referring to is this condition of the nafs. And the nafs generally is in this place. It's in the place of the chest, which is also where the sadr is, or the heart is. And so if it's the animal self, then that is reflective of the animal heart. As the Quran says, وَلَقَدْ ذَرَعْنَا كَثِيرًا مِنَ الْجِنِّ وَالْإِنسِ لَجَهَنَّمَ, that we'll put many of men and jinn into hellfire. Why? It then gives us the conditions of those people. It says, لَهُمْ قُلُوبٌ لَا يَعْقِلُونَ بِهَا, they have hearts which they do not think with. لَهُمْ أَعْيُنٌ لَا يُبْصِرُونَ بِهَا, they have eyes which they do not see with. لَهُمْ آذَانٌ لَا يَسْمَعُونَ بِهَا, they have ears which they do not hear with. And this is talking about the ears and the eyes of the heart and the intellect of the heart, not of the physical body or the head. أُولَٰئِكَ كَالْأَنْعَامِ, they are like the cattle or the four-legged creatures. بَلْ هُمْ أَضَلُّ, rather they are more misguided. أُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الْغَافِلُونَ, they are the absolutely heedless. So this nafs al-Amara, is a state of heedlessness. It's a state which is unaware, unawoken. It's in a state which is a state of ghafla, which is to be heedless. And it has no concern or care for religious obligations or righteousness or virtues. It just wants to pursue its own desires. What is dictated by the word heart is not a piece of flesh. It's a metaphysical reality. It's the soul. But it is a metaphysically subtly established by the Lord, which may lean towards the physical body and which may become established in following its appetites. So if the heart becomes, it turns away from God and becomes engaged with the physical body or the animalistic desires, then this becomes the Nafs al-Amara, which is the animal spirit that commands towards evil. It's a very egotistical type of nafsiyah. The animal spirit which loses its preferred qualities and takes on lowly qualities. So it doesn't engage or seek out the preferred lofty qualities, but with the undesirable qualities. It becomes like the animals. The shaitan becomes one of its soldiers. So, it becomes a soldier for shaitan, and also the shaitan becomes one of its soldiers. Some of its qualities are arrogance, so egotism, arrogance, anger, appetite, envy, forgetfulness, hatred, harm, ignorance, greed, and other undesirable qualities. The Prophet ﷺ said, "A'da aduwik nafsika allati bayna jambayk," that your greatest enemy is yourself. So your greatest enemy is not the outward self, the outward enemy outside of you, but it's your own self. And this hadith is specifically referring to the Nafs al-Amara. Because when you look at the Nafs, for instance, the perfect soul, Nafs al-Kamila, it's no longer your biggest enemy because you've reached perfection. So there are certain traditions that are referring to particular types of nafs. So this hadith is referring specifically to the nafs al-Amara. And this is because the nafs inhabits darkness of the physical world. So this nafs is veiled. It has lots of hijabs on it. It does not distinguish between right and wrong, truth and the haqq and falsehood, and the force or the battle. It does not distinguish between good and evil. The accursed shaitan cannot influence humanity except through its venue. So when shaitan influences us in any particular way, it's actually through the nafs al-Amara. Continuing here. So the station in which the nafs is called the inciting or Amara, inciting towards evil, is a prison and is the lowest of the low, and thus is most important to be freed from. The raising of the voice of God within, which is a dhikr, so when you begin to remind yourself or remember and remember God, whether that be through your mind, the intellect, recalling God and thinking of God and reflecting on God, so having tafakkur, or through incantations, through the tongue, through your words, or through presence in your heart, where you have dhikr of Allah and presence of Him in your heart. This is important at this stage to awaken the nafs from its habitual forgetfulness, to awaken it from the state of being heedless, of ghafla. And here there is a role of fear and hope at this station. And the role here is that one should have a lot of fear at this station. And we talk a lot in our tradition about balancing your fear and your hope of God. But this nafs, in order to come out of it, has to have a slight degree more fear than hope. And the reason being, and obviously I don't encourage this as something which is a permanence, that we shouldn't permanently have fear and hope. And Imam Ghazali was classically was one of the opinion that we should have more hope than we have fear of God. And other scholars have had said different things, but generally we should have a balance of the two. But in this station, for reasons of arising above and excelling, one should have more fear, in the sense that they should fear from the nature of the nafs and what it desires and what it wants and what it wishes to pursue and the way it is, so as to overcome those things and to flee away from them and to rise and transcend them, rise above them. Further down the journey, when you progress down this journey, that fear then becomes translated or changed rather into qabd, which is constriction. So you may find a lot that people talk about this state of being constricted internally, or feeling the state of expansion and vastness and openness. Prophet Musa, the famous dua, he has Rabbi shrah li sadri, or Allah expand my chest. This state of, which is a state of hope, really, because when you're in this expansive state, then your energy is open, and you're in this place of vastness, and a place, when you are open, you're in a place of recipiency. So you are existentially expansive and open and able to receive. So there is a relationship that you have between you and creation existentially, and therefore you and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you and God, the creator, the one infinite creator. So when you yourself are expansive, you're in this place to have an open and connected relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But when you are in this constricted state, whether that's internal constriction within you or constriction of your mind, which is also reflected in the state of constriction of the heart, then you feel like you are isolated or disconnected and no longer able to connect to existentially to existence or creation or the creator. So when you further down the journey, those states of hope and fear become expressed in this way of states of abth and states of expansion or bust. And that will become clearer as we go along with these sessions. The next station, which is an-Nafs al-Lawama, I'm going to leave for the next lesson, because we've spoken for quite a while now, and I want to see if anybody has any questions or comments or anything that they want to share. And also, I don't want to start this because it's quite detailed, and we'll leave it for next time. So I'll stop there. So anyone has any questions or comments or anything that they want to share, please feel free to do so now. And whilst we're waiting, I hope that the session was useful, and that you did benefit from the content. So if anybody wants to say anything or has any comments, feel free to unmute yourselves.
May I?
Yes, of course. Please.
Okay, so as far as I could understand, there are 7 stations of the soul, and I understand them as 7 levels that we have to pass. Does it mean that to go to the next level, we must completely, how can I say, annihilate the previous one within ourselves? What I wanted to say, is it even possible to completely delete this first station that you mentioned, Nafs al-Amara? Is it even possible to completely delete all of the aspects of that station to be able to transcend into the next one?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. Now, to answer your question, we have to realize that there's 2 things. Number one is something which is a state, which is a hal, and something which is a station, which is a maqam. Now, we may progress through the stations or the maqamat, and at times experience states of the other stations. But what's really governing us is that particular station. So, for instance, someone may excel Nafs al-Amara and go into a Nafs al-Lawama, which is the second level. But at times, they experience states of Nafs al-Amara. That's not their station. That's not where they're residing. That's not where they're spiritually sat. But that they're just having a state or a condition. It may be like a relapse. Maybe they're just experiencing a few things that they have been left undealt with. But they will experience that, but they'll generally come back to where their maqam, their station, where they are. So that's the first thing. The other thing is, can we progress through one stage to the other? Does it have to be something which is consecutive, that we go through one level to the other? Generally, most people who traverse the journey, yes, that is the case. Most people, they go through these stations one after the other. But obviously, everyone is relative to their own selves, but you go through one to the other. But there is something which is a jadhabiyya, which is called attraction. So there's a salik, or a spiritual aspirant, who traverses a path, and they go from one thing to the other, and as they progress, they continuously develop and evolve until they eventually reach Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or the complete soul. But there is a state which, for the select and the elite, whom Allah chooses and wishes to attract him directly straight to him, without them going through the path. And this is a jadhabiyya, a salik al-jadhib, or a majdub as-salik, meaning the one who is taken from where they are, and it may be even their lowliest state, and Allah takes them to the end in one instance, for whatever reasons, because of a favor, or because of some kind of sincere act or something that they've done. He propels them from that beginning to the last station. And so they don't go through the stations one by one. And this is very rare. But he takes them to the end. And then after they've reached that pace, then they go through understanding the process. So they're majdoob, meaning that they're attracted all the way to the end, to Allah, to the goal. And then they are salik, then they slowly, but their station is here. But they go through this to understand it and experience it. Sometimes people who don't go through the process may not necessarily know how to guide other people because they don't know the in-betweens. But the salik al-majzub, the one who traverses the path stage by stage, he may reach the point where he can guide other people because he knows exactly what it means to go through that station and what it looks like and how it's translated and what the conditions are of that particular thing. So yes, to answer your question, there are some people who can jump, and that's by way of favor of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and divine grace. But that's something which is rare. Most people have to work to refine themselves and to develop themselves through the various stations to go to the next one. And the first is that yes, the people can relapse and sometimes they may progress or they may go back. But we have to look at what is a station and what is a state and decipher the two. So sometimes you may have states of a higher level, but that's not your maqam. For instance, you have a particular area in your life that you have pure sincerity in this, but you're still governed by Nafs al-Amara for whatever reasons, or Nafs al-Lawama, this, the reproaching soul, which we'll talk about in the subsequent session. You might still be governed by that, but you've managed to arrive at a deeper level of sincerity, but it's not the defining thing about your character. You're not sincere in all things. It's not your station, but you've only experienced a state of that. Okay, so I hope that answers your question. Are there any other questions? By the way, that was a very good question. Thank you for that.
I have one.
Yeah, sure.
It's not. I don't know if it's a good question, but you said that we should separate our personality to our traits. But isn't it that we get our traits from having our personality, even if it's good or bad traits?
Yeah. So what I was saying is to separate the person or the individual from the traits. This doesn't mean that we have to be people who are naive and say, oh, well, I'm going to see this person and separate that person from all the bad things that they have. Generally speaking, of course, if a person has lots of, I don't like to use the word bad, but because I was advised to not use that kind of language, but someone who has undesirable traits, right? So a person may have certain a number of undesirable traits. Yes, that's going to define who they are. It's going to define their character and what they're about. But what we're saying here is that sometimes we have to also see and realize that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created everyone. And so everything is a creation of His. Everything is makhluq Allah. And He has favored those individuals by making them a human being or an insan, or by giving them life. And He's the one who's sustaining them and nourishing them and taking care of them and providing for them. So what we have to realize is that we can't, because of one or two bad qualities, discard the entire person for everything that they are, or because of one slip, or because of one minor action. For instance, everyone in the world knows that Usain Bolt is the fastest runner in the world. Everybody knows that if Usain Bolt is on the track, he's going to win the race. Everybody knows that he's broken all the records for being the fastest sprinter. But if one day Usain Bolt is on the track and he's running and he pulls a muscle or he gets a cramp while he's running and he loses the race, no one's going to go around and say, Usain Bolt is useless now. Usain Bolt is no longer the fastest man in the world. Usain Bolt is pathetic. Nobody's going to say that because everybody knows that he's proven that he's the fastest man, and it was just one occasion where he had, for whatever reasons he defaulted, or for whatever reasons he slipped, or for whatever reasons he pulled a muscle, for whatever reasons he got a cramp. And these things happen. Certain people in their lives, they're very good people, but sometimes they just have a minor slip. It's not right for us to completely discard them and everything about them because of a minor slip. And so this was in the context of when you see a particular attribute or characteristic of a person or a bad thing, that thing, that may be that Allah's trying to reveal or show you a particular thing about that person that you need to be aware of. But not that you completely discard everything about that person. In the same way that, we gave the example of that check, the £1 million check, or that really valuable piece of jewelry. You don't completely discard everything about it because of a minor glitch or a minor imperfection. So that's the context. But again, yes, we shouldn't be naive in the way we interact with people. And yeah, we should be aware of if a person has a number of undesirable traits, that yeah, we should seek to separate ourselves from that, because the Quran tells us that there are these people whom Allah says يُمَيِّزُ الْخَبِيثُ مِنَ الطَّيِّبِ, to distinguish and decipher those who are of a good disposition, or have goodness within them, and those who are khabith, those who have evil inside them, or who have some kind of filth within them. Or يُمَيِّزُ الْحَقُّ مِنَ الْبَاطِلِ, to decipher truth and falsehood. So there are people who, they're over the majority of their characteristics dictate that they are, for instance, khabith. And someone who's tayyib, someone who has goodness and purity within them, should naturally avoid and stay away from those who are khubatha, those who have evil within them. But this is just this distinction that I gave of having tafkik, separating the quality and the person, is just for the purpose of understanding that sometimes we may see particular things in a particular way, and that's how we should also operate with people, and not judge people. Also, this also helps to remove judgmentalism. How sometimes we may judge people because of a minor slip, or we may be unforgiving towards them because of a particular thing that they're working with, but it's undesirable. But we know that they have lots of good things about them. So it's about putting things into perspective.